So right now, scientists are debating whether a quarter, a third, or fully half of all mammals will be extinct by 2050. In fact, some of them are debating whether the planet will be supporting life at all by the end of this century. What's not up for debate, not ever, is a culture that devours with an entitlement so profound, it is turning the planet to dust. The dust is not hyperbole. The dust storms in China, the inevitable endpoint of agriculture, the dust storms are so bad they are triggering asthma in children in Denver, Colorado. So here's the dust in China. It's leaving the coast. It goes over the Pacific Ocean, hits the Rocky Mountains, and it comes down. I know it's unbearable. Reality is an avalanche of grief right now. But I'm asking each of you to take your heart out of cold storage. You put it there for safekeeping, I know. But there is no safety on a planet being murdered. The French word for heart is the root of our word courage. To face facts, we will need our hearts. To face down power, which is what everyone here is proposing, and a modest proposal it is not, we will need all the courage of which our hearts are capable. All right, this can't be done in a soundbite, so you're going to have to stay with me. Back up 4 million years. Don't worry, we're going to go fast. Australopithecines emerges on the plains of Africa. 2.3 million years ago, the genus Homo arrives, and that's us. Homo habilis uses stone tools, has the brain about the size of a chimpanzee. Over the next million years, their cranial capacity doubled, and Homo erectus emerges. And they're the first to use fire and complex tools. Homo sapiens appears 400,000 years ago, and by 200,000 years ago, they're identical to modern humans. By 100,000 years ago, we're burying our dead, and we're doing it ritualistically. The bodies are painted, they're positioned, they have grave goods. By 50,000 years ago, we've got modern human culture. People are making clothes from hides, they're making jewelry, they're making musical instruments. There's barter, clearly, and there's art. What are we painting? Well, we're painting a lot of animals. Pablo Picasso went to see Lascaux when it was open to the public, and he commented after he emerged, "We have invented nothing," meaning that whole sweep of Western art, nothing was original. It was all there 20,000 years ago. And this is the second most common art project. This goddess was found in a cave in southern Germany. She's about 40,000 years old. She is, in fact, the oldest piece of figurative sculpture ever found. She's carved from a woolly mammoth tusk, probably took 100 hours to carve. The oldest known musical instrument was found near her. It's a flute carved from a vulture bone, and the usual remains of all the animals people were eating. The first art we ever made was of the megafauna and the megafemales, because that was who gave us life. The first thing we did with our human consciousness was say thank you. I think this is the beginning of religion, and that sacredness of awe and thanksgiving is built into us, body and brain. And for all that time, for 2.5 million years, we were not monsters and destroyers. We were participants. If the whole length of that field is our time on Earth, the last half a yard represents the length of time we've been doing agriculture. The last 1/5 of an inch would be the Industrial Revolution. So at half a yard is where the disaster begins. In maybe 14 places around the globe, people completely changed their way of life with an activity called agriculture. So you have to understand what agriculture is. In very brute terms, you take a piece of land, you clear every living thing off it, and I mean down to the bacteria, and then you plant it for human use. So it's biotic cleansing. This is Iraq, one of the places where agriculture started. No one in their right mind would call this place the Fertile Crescent now. This is Iran. 94% of Iran's agricultural land is degraded. That's a dust storm in the background. That is not a mountain. Pakistan, a third of Pakistan is under risk of desertification. This was a deciduous forest 150 years ago, a teak forest. So this is inevitable. This isn't agriculture on a bad day. This isn't agriculture done poorly. This is what agriculture is. You pull down the forest, you rip up the prairie, you drain the wetland, you exsanguinate the world of water and soil and species and the process of life itself until all that is left is dust. Now, a lot of people get confused right here. It's not our fault. There is a profound cultural ignorance about the material base of our society, about what agriculture is. So I'm going to walk you through this because I want you to hate me. Yeah, that was a joke, so knock yourselves out. I want the people who care the most about the planet to understand the depth of the problem. That's all I want. So think about what's outside your kitchen window. Most likely you have trees or a small patch of lawn. So you either have a microforest or a mini prairie. Now let's say you want to grow some corn or some lettuce. You can't just throw some seeds around and hope for the best. Nothing will happen. Trust me, I tried. Yes, the crazy runs deep. Those seeds will never outcompete the trees and the grass. If you want corn or lettuce, you already know what you have to do. You chop down the tree, you dig up the grass. You pull down the forest, you plow up the prairie. You have to destroy the biotic community. So to state the obvious, no culture that is destroying the basis of life can be called sustainable. Really, it can only be called insane. In all the places where agriculture started, human society follows the same pattern. It's called civilization. Now that word, civilization, that just means people living in cities. What that actually means is they need more than the land can give. The food, water, energy have to come from somewhere else. From that point forward, it doesn't matter what lovely, peaceful values people might hold in their hearts. Society is dependent on imperialism and genocide because no one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees. But since the city has used up its own, it has to go out and get those from somewhere else. And that's the last 10,000 years in a few sentences. Now the central concept here is drawdown. If you use more wood than a forest can grow, eventually the forest will be gone. If you take fish faster than they can reproduce, one day the river will be nothing but water and sorrow. And then there are things that don't reproduce, things like oil, things like coal. Using them at all means using them up. It can only be drawdown. You can blow up mountains to get to the last of it, but now you're drawing down mountains as well as coal, and at the end of the day, it's still gone. Now this isn't a differential equation. It's not even algebra. It's simple arithmetic. If you have one planet, one blanket of air, one cradle of soil, one place called home, and you destroy it, it's 1 minus 1. Our planet needs us to do the math. No one seems willing. They can put a man on the moon, they can't do 1 minus 1. Our planet needs us to be, in the words of the inimitable James Howard Kunstler, reality-based adults. That 1 minus 1 isn't a surprise. It didn't sneak up on us. It's been going on for 10,000 years. It's the longest war ever. It's the pattern of civilization. Over and over and over, there's a bloated power center surrounded by conquered colonies from which the center extracts what it wants until eventually it collapses. And that collapse takes between 800 and 2,000 years until the soil gives out. Because the primary activity of civilization is agriculture, and agriculture is drawdown. To give you a number, one season of planting your basic grain crop, say wheat or corn or soy, one season, you can destroy 2,000 years of soil. Make no mistake, the planet has been skinned alive, and what should be habitat for millions of creatures turns into salt and dust. Agriculture is carnivorous. What it eats is entire ecosystems, and that's what it's done across the globe. Now, agricultural societies end up militarized, and they always do, for 3 reasons. 1, agriculture creates a surplus, and if it can be stored, it can be stolen. So the surplus needs to be protected. 2 is imperialism. Agriculture is a war against the natural world. Eventually, the agriculturalists need more land, more soil, more resources. So there's an entire class of people whose job is war, whose job is taking land and resources by force. Agriculture makes that possible. It also makes it inevitable. And 3 is slavery. Agriculture is also backbreaking labor. For anyone to have leisure, they need slaves. By the year 1800, which is the beginning of the industrial age, fully 3/4 of the human beings alive on the planet were living in conditions of either slavery, indenture, or serfdom. 3/4. The only reason we have forgotten this is because we're using machines now, fossil fuel, to do that work. And of course, once you have huge numbers of the population in slavery, you need someone to keep them there, hence soldiers. So this is the cycle we've been on for 10,000 years. Once upon a time, there were elephants all the way to China. In California's Central Valley, there were flocks of water birds so dense they blocked out the sun. In the Pacific Northwest, when the salmon returned to spawn, you could hear the fish coming for an entire day. You could hear them coming. It sounded like rolling thunder. There are still people alive who heard this, but I have never once heard the sound that water makes when 40 million years of persistence finds its way home. This is who has been taken from you here in this place: the gray partridge and the heath hen, the swamp rabbit and the fisher cat, the Eastern American bison. Unimaginable numbers of bison migrated from southern Wisconsin through Indiana to the mild winters and bluegrass of Kentucky, leaving a literal trace. There were millions of them once. Now all that's left is a statue. And all of them, every last one, should ache like a phantom limb. There are lists of the damned. You will need your hearts to face this. I know what I'm asking, but better a broken heart than no heart at all, because even a broken heart is still made of love. And here we are at the end of the world. Pull down the forest, plow up the prairie, 1 minus 1. 98% of the world's old-growth forests and 99% of the world's prairies are gone. There's nothing left to take. Now, Lewis Mumford understood that technologies create their own social institutions and ideologies to defend them. He made the distinction between authoritarian and democratic technologies. A culture invents specific technologies, which in turn change the culture. There is a co-action between a culture and its technologies. Both form the other in an interactive process. He called the result, the totality of a culture and its technology, a technic. Technics will either be authoritarian or democratic, hierarchical or egalitarian. They are never neutral. Or, as Chellis Glendinning writes with clarity, all technologies are political. The conquest is never just physical. Civilization consumes the culture as well. So the very creation myth of Western civilization tells men to dominate, to conquer, to go forth and multiply. No hunter-gatherer is told by God to willfully overshoot the land's carrying capacity, and no rational person would listen to such a God. The founding myth also condemns women to sexual subjugation. Why is not a mystery. Patriarchy becomes a primary feature of civilization because its scarcity of land, of labor, of food drives the concept of private property. Matrifocal cultures have little investment in paternity. The central social unit is mother and child, not man-wife. And a woman's brothers, not her sexual partners, are the men who help provide for her children. With private property comes inheritance and the need to establish male heirs. The valuing of paternity makes male violence inevitable. The only way a man can know for sure of his offspring is through total control of a woman's body. So across history, men have devised a range of constraints, from restrictions on women's basic freedom of movement to the lifelong tortures of foot binding and FGM, to ensure that male children are indeed their sons. Authoritarian technology needs an authoritarian God, so meaning was drained from the living world and placed above in an angry sky father, who reigns rather than participates, punishes instead of heals. Even still, the image of the earth as a living body persisted in the West until the co-joined scientific and commercial revolutions. Writes Carolyn Merchant, quote, "Between the 16th and 17th centuries, the image of an organic cosmos with a living female earth at its center gave way to a mechanistic worldview in which nature was reconstructed as dead and passive, to be dominated and controlled by humans. The new technology of domination included, well, all of this. This is essentially a list of torture implements for the living earth. Merchant calls this the mechanization of nature, and it has, of course, only gotten worse. It also had to be paid for. You understand, none of this existed. They had to pay for it to create it. The large commercial banks all owned mines, which require enormous stretches of timber for charcoal and smelting. The destruction of the earth to fuel and then fund more of the same in an absolutely vicious circle. With the end of the forests came the beginning of coal. The new technologies would be powered by fossil fuels, and with essentially unlimited power, there would be no limits to the destruction. The only constraint left was cultural, but the concept of a living world would be finally severed on the dissection slab of mechanistic science. Francis Bacon is considered the father of the scientific revolution. He argued that man may be regarded as the center of the world, but the whole world works together in the service of man. Plants and animals of all kinds are made to furnish him. All things seem to be going about man's business, not their own. Nature is the base material for men's actualization, and men should use her. The domination granted by science would let men, quote, change, transmute, and fundamentally alter nature. That was the goal. He bluntly stated the goal of all authoritarian techniques, such a deep understanding of nature's secrets that men's power over her would be practically unlimited. Bacon's vision is now here. Industrial technology has emptied rivers, crushed mountains, and damaged the climate itself. Its power only limited because the planet has in fact turned out to be finite. Mumford describes how, with the knitting together of a scientific ideology, authoritarian techniques found an instrument at hand that has now given it absolute command of physical energies of cosmic dimensions. He calls the result the mega machine, a seamless suite of centralized political and economic power, science and technology, whose final goal is to displace life. It's created a world entirely of objects, mechanical instead of living, manufactured, not born, which Jerry Mander called the technosphere. And it's been measured. The technosphere, from skyscrapers to cell phones, weighs 30 trillion tons, which is 7 times more than the current mass of all living creatures. Or, as science writer Bob McDonald said, our technology is a superorganism that competes with the biosphere for resources and is winning that competition by taking over the surface of the planet. The critics become Cassandras. No one is listening. Mumford saw that the culture is in the grip of an, quote, irrational compulsion. It is irrational to bleed the life out of the only planet you have, but the compulsion has an inner coherence, the predictable consequence of the psychology required by the soldier rapists of patriarchy. Masculinity is constructed on what sociologists call a, quote, negative reference group. And here's a quote, a group rejected by or in opposition to one's own group. It is the enemy or the negative group. It's the thing you don't want to be. For boys in patriarchal cultures, their first despised other is, of course, girls. The first rule of masculinity is that whatever he is, women are not. Once that psychological process is in place, the category female can be filled with any group that a hierarchical society needs subordinated. The need is endless when the culture is using up trees, soil, species, and slaves, but it's also endless when men's psychology is based on sadism. Psychiatrist Eric defines sadism as the passion to have absolute and unrestricted control over a living being. Or, as Derrick Jensen describes with spare eloquence, for men in patriarchy, everything is violable and everything must be violated. A personality with an endless drive to prove itself against another, any other, creates a violation imperative. Men become real men by breaking boundaries. The sexual boundaries of women, the political boundaries of other people, the biological boundaries of living communities, the genetic boundaries of species, and the physical boundaries of the atom itself. But the sadist is never satisfied. There is always another wild being or self-willed creature, not, quote, in the service of men, who must be broken and brought to heel. Quote, the power of sex is ultimately defined as the power of conquest, wrote Andrea Dworkin, who well knew. Male supremacy eroticizes domination and subordination, inscribing synapses of sadism into the brain. Anything tied to sexual response will feel not just natural, but primal. Arousal lights up the limbic system, a part of the brain so ancient it's found in all vertebrates. It also shuts down parts of the prefrontal cortex, which is what heroin does. A surge of dopamine and endorphins produce euphoria, followed by oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. Every area of the brain involved in sex is activated maximally. There is no stronger endogenous stimuli. That potent ecstasy should create deep and abiding intimacy. The process is there, built into us body and brain, waiting to flower. That process has been hijacked, not just by patriarchy, but specifically by the pornography industry. The scale of the takeover is nearly inconceivable. Pornography sites get more traffic than Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and LinkedIn combined. Close to 1/3 of all downloads in the US are from a porn site. In 2019, uploads to Pornhub came to 12,500 gigabytes per minute. That's enough content to fill the memory of every single cell phone on the planet every minute. Across the culture, this vicious industry is rewriting our collective sexual script. In the words of neuroscientist Dr. Norman Deutsch, fusing sex with hatred and humiliation. Women are being strangled to unconsciousness is now a common feature on popular porn sites. Dr. Deutsch explains, pornography satisfies every one of the prerequisites for neuroplastic change. When the pornographers boast that they are pushing the envelope by introducing new, harder themes, what they don't say is that they must, because their customers are building up a tolerance to the content. And then these men, saturated in sexual sadism, interact with women in real life. There's a surge in the so-called rough sex defense. To put it bluntly, men are strangling women to death for sexual pleasure and getting away with it. The generative impulse of our species, biologically rich with exquisite nerves and alchemical joy, has been transmuted into necrophilia. In the subordination of women, inequality itself is sexualized, made into the experience of sexual pleasure, essential to sexual desire, wrote Andrea Dworkin. This is both the core of patriarchy and its brilliance. The brilliance of feminism is that we figured that out. Now, women took the tools of political analysis learned on the left and applied them to our own lives. Teach slaves to read, and eventually they revolt. Eventually, they also write their own political theory. The worst subordination women experience is in the realm called private, done by men who claim to love us through actions they experience as sex. If one woman told the truth about her life, wrote poet Muriel Rukeyser, the world would split open. We did, by the hundreds and then the thousands, and then we started counting. The numbers are a trauma all their own. Battering, for instance, in the United States, a man beats up a woman every 9 seconds. 1/3 of all battering starts when a woman is pregnant. And male violence, a man's willful foot or fist, is the #1 cause of birth defects. 80,000 American children are sexually abused every year, and 80% of the time, quote, a parent is the perpetrator, yet you know it's not their mothers. One by one, men do this to the most vulnerable. Children are so easy to control, and even easier to hurt. The small bones break, the fragile tissues tear, the fledgling self splinters from its only body. 80,000 times a year, the world should stop spinning, and it doesn't, and I don't know why. Globally, 60 million child brides, 200 million survivors of FGM, 126 million girls aborted for being female. This is why we call it a war. If these numbers aren't just background noise, the inevitable, unremarkable actions of everyday men taking what is theirs, but actual crimes done to human beings, then there is a word for harm at this scale. War fits, but men scoff when we say it. Fine, but I would like to know what other word to use. What feminists see is that the war against women and the war against the earth have not just the same driver, but the same endpoint, necrophilia. 2 centuries ago, Mary Shelley, a teenager, left us Frankenstein as a warning. A young scientist has, quote, one thought, one conception, one purpose, to conquer life. He has the generative capacity given to all living creatures, but he doesn't want to be a participant in the natural cycle of birth and death. He wants what science is seeking, quote, immortality and power. He knows that boundary breaking is required. Quote, life and death appear to me ideal bonds which I should first break through. The necrophilia is stark. He collects bones from charnel houses and worse. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? He collapses after his success, falling into a nightmare vision of his dead mother. The mother, the source of life, is a corpse in this new world made by men. Shelley's warning wasn't heeded. Neither was philosopher Mary Daly's. This was written in 1978. The Frankenstein phenomena is omnipresent, not only in religious myth, but in its offspring, phallocratic technology. The insane desire for power, the madness of boundary violation, is the mark of necrophiliacs, who sense the soul, spirit, life-loving principle with themselves, the lack of soul, spirit, life-loving principle with themselves, and therefore try to invade and kill off all spirit, substituting conglomerates of corpses. Transsexualism is an example of male surgical siring, which invades the female world with substitutes. Male-mothered genetic engineering is an attempt to create without women. The projected manufacture by men of artificial wombs, of cyborgs, which will be part flesh, part robot, of clones, are all manifestations of phallotechnic boundary violation. The pseudo-creative power of boundary violation is clearly an invasion of women's bodies, spirits, and of all our kind, earth, air, fire, water. As the living world has been turned into the technosphere, so the human body is under the same assault. Guy Debord wrote presciently of the society of the spectacle, where, quote, being becomes having, and having is reduced to merely appearing. This is the reign of the image, made supreme by social media. We are no longer our bodies with their animal integrity, but wardens in a pornopticon, watching ourselves watch ourselves. To be seen is to be disciplined, but to be invisible is to die. The young are especially being destroyed by the impossibility of this experience, girls most of all. Teen porn is, of course, one of the most common internet search terms globally, and girls have to live in the same world, both online and off, as the men who type it. And that transsexualism is now a driving narrative of disembodiment and dismemberment, with the medical procedures to match. Our bodies are now things we have, things made up of other things, collections of replaceable parts. Breasts, vaginas, penises can be bought, as can puberty, or so claim the modern-day Dr. Frankensteins. In reality, the sexed body, like the prairies and the forests, like the planet itself, is a living process with its own self-willed integrity. The effects of puberty-blocking drugs are catastrophic on bones, brains, and sex organs. The addition of wrong sex hormones damages the heart, liver, reproductive tract, and reduces lifespan. Perfectly healthy children are being turned into lifelong medical patients, permanently sterilized before their first kiss, a kiss they may never have, given that a sex drive is one main point of puberty. And the surgical simulacra of both male and female genitalia are human rights abuses that should be done to no one. This is a movement arguing for the destruction of the generative organs of children. The only word I have for that is necrophilia. The essential disembodiment of the internet is the dream of the necrophiliac, obsessed as they are with robots and machines. There are now men who want us to upload ourselves into the internet. Tech millionaire Martin Rothblatt is one of them. He also declares himself a woman. In reality, the name for his condition is autogynephilia. Autogynephilia is the term for the sexual fetish of men who are aroused by imagining they are women. AGPs are obsessed with an image of themselves, so it should come as no surprise that 57% of them present with a prior diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. Rothblatt wrote a whole book arguing that anything belonging to women, from words for our bodies to separate spaces for our safety, is a form of apartheid, so egregious is the harm to men like him. His life goal is, quote, to tear down walls and barriers that exist between the digital world and the biological existence and doing so with the creation of a new species of robot. Note that he made a robot to replicate his wife and gave it her name, Bina. This is where the Stepford Wives meet Silence of the Lambs. He also started a religion, it's called Terrasim. In Truths of the Terrasim, which is his Bible, he outlines how nanobots will replace all life, humans will upload themselves into computers to live forever, and technology will take over the universe, becoming omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipotent. He says point blank that he is creating God. At least Victor Frankenstein, in all his arrogance, was content to create a humanoid. Rothblatt intends to do away with biology entirely. This is narcissistic rage, driving the disordered to his predictable endpoint, necrophilia, in rage that he can never be a woman, which he must know beneath his dense layers of denial. He would destroy all life in revenge. And so the technosphere will end at the necrosphere. This is what feminists know. The male erotic trinity, sex, violence, and death, reigns supreme. Andrea Dworkin tried to show the world what she had learned through the childhood molestation, the battering, and all the rapes. Men tell us who they are. Believe them. When bison are under attack, they pack into a tight circle. Protected at the center are the mothers and babies. Next are the older calves, weaned and vulnerable. A defensive ring of cows without young comes next. And finally, facing out stand the bulls. We are under attack. Every last creature is under threat. He has leveled mountains. Believe him when he tells you. If we all make that tight circle, mothers and babies of every species at the center, protected until the last, and plant our feet firmly on our still living earth, we can face him down. He has the rancid thrills of sadism and the sterile dreams of machines. We have love, and the miracle of our animal bodies, and the stalwart light of every dawn. Don't let him win. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to check on the time.